Hi, welcome back to Unmasking the Trans Movement with John Euler. I'm your host, Brad Wilder. Today on the show, Nadine Ness from Unified Grassroots will be here out of Saskatchewan, right here in Canada. She has lots to talk about on how predators gain access. More from John and Nadine right after these. Exposing SOGI123.com provides all the info you'll need to protect your children and family from this transgender ideology. Exposing SOGI123.com has done all the work for you to take a stand and be heard. With dozens of letters pre-written to every official you can think of within your province, the documents provided are fill in the blank so you can amend and send. It's that simple. Make your voice heard and count for the children to the highest levels of provincial and so-called federal political leaders, health ministers, school board officials, and more. Exposing SOGI123.com, where the facts are real. Welcome back to Unmasking the Trans Movement with John Euler. I'm Brad Wilder. Today on the show, John Euler is here along with Nadine Ness from Unified Grassroots out of Saskatchewan, Canada. And we're going to sit down with Nadine and have a great talk about all kinds of, well, I guess situations that predators are actually gaining access to not only adults, but kids now as well. And that's the real important part. Adults, they can fight for themselves, but kids, this is where it gets sexually deviant and disgusting. Let's bring in the expert, John Euler. John, great to have you on the program today. You've brought a fantastic guest, Nadine Ness, who has been part of the movement here to, I guess, bring a block and an understanding and an education level to all parents here in Canada about what's really going on, not only in our education system, but just within the indoctrination of this whole movement. John, thanks for being here today.
And Brad, thank you. As always, couldn't do it without you. And I can't think of anybody better, more equipped than Nadine. Nadine, welcome. Thank you so much for being with us. You are a go-getter. Yeah, you got, I forget how many followers on your Twitter page. Not that always represents, reflects good or bad, but in your case, you came to my attention because I saw you speaking out, and I thought there's somebody speaking out against the trans deception, how predators are able to gain access to kids. And then you being from Canada, I knew you were very well apprised of what's going on, the implications of what's happening. So I reached out and felt you were the right person at the right time for us to have on the program. So thank you for being our guest.
Thanks for having me.
Well, for those that don't know you, why don't you, first of all, mention how they can access your work and what you do, and then let's talk about how you became an activist. That can either be a positive or negative connotation, but in this case, it's a very positive thing because you felt compelled, based upon your background and your training and your experience, to let people know how predators operate. That fits very much with what Brad and I are doing on this program. Dr. Ann Gillies, you and Dr. Ann are going to be speaking together soon. So talk to us, introduce yourself to the audience as far as first, where can they find you? And then give us a little bit about your background and how you became so concerned about this.
Sure. So I'm the president of a nonprofit organization called Unified Grassroots. We are mostly on Facebook. We started as a Facebook group called Unified Grassroots. Do not put in United Grassroots. We do have someone imitating us out there. So Unified Grassroots, we have a public page, a private Facebook page as well. I'll get into why it's private. We weren't intentioning to start something this big, but I'm also on Twitter. If you search at Nadine G Ness, you'll find me on Twitter. I've had a Twitter account for less than 2 years, and yes, it's quite big. I still get shocked at how many followers I get on Twitter, but I think it's because I speak passionately about something I really care about. And there's not a lot of people with the background that I have that speak about what's happening.
As a matter of fact, Nadine, I'm going to bring up your page so people can know that they have the right Nadine. And in a few minutes, we're going to play an excerpt from the video that you created. You did an outstanding job talking about your concerns about predators. So if anybody has access to Twitter, that is your page, and you're inching up to 37,000. So that's you're making an impact.
Yeah, it's a little bit surreal when you count, like, our group. We started from very humble beginnings. I'll get into that a little bit. I don't like the term activist because I never went looking to become an activist. What happened is we were a group of parents that were concerned over the COVID policies in the schools. And it was over a Facebook post on a town page. A lady asked, when's the next school board meeting? And I said, hey, I'm concerned too. Do you want to meet up at my house? And she had a few other parents, like maybe 3 or 4. So I started a Facebook group to share my address on there. And within 24 hours, we had 850 parents join that Facebook group. And then within 3 more days later, we had 2,500. We ended up having a town hall, and that's where our organization was born. So initially, we wanted parental involvement in the decisions that were being had in the schools. So that's how we started. And then it just grew and grew and grew. And we had success in getting policy changes when it came to COVID stuff in the province. And then I know COVID can be a divisive thing, but we really strongly believe that parents should have a say into their children's education, especially when it comes to their health as well. So that's kind of how it started. And then it just moved on to this because it seems to be very similar, where parents concerned aren't being listened to. They're not being allowed to speak out publicly on what's happening. They're not being allowed to go on school board meetings and stuff. It's the same thing we face.
Nadine, when you say this, it's the reason you're here, everything to do with what's being called the trans movement.
Yes. So initially was the whole COVID thing, but then we kind of realized anything that goes against the grain or the woke agenda, we've become like the voice in the province. So it's just natural that it moved to that. So not just the trans movement, but just the gender ideology that's happening in the schools. And some of the other stuff too, the sexualization of children. And in Saskatchewan, because our organization is one of the only ones with a big voice and a big reach, we become the hub for kind of anything negative that's happening to children that people aren't getting a voice in the media. So anything that involves LGBTQ, unless you're pushing that agenda, you don't really have a voice in this province. So we happen to be the hub where we hear of everything that's happening. So same with like the incident in Lumsden, Saskatchewan, which I speak about in the video. We were one of the first organization to find out, and we were actually the only place where the information of what actually happened went out, because parents were so afraid of speaking to media, because anytime you speak about something that goes against the agenda or the ideology, you get demonized. So because of that, we were very much involved with bringing light to what actually happened.
You want to give a little context for those that don't know what you're referencing?
Sure. Yeah. So what happened is, in a grade 9 classroom, an organization called Planned Parenthood, and they are in Canada, they are in Regina, came in to do a sexual education presentation. And with that kind of, not in the presentation, but shortly after, they engaged students with what I would call sexually explicit cards or porn cards. When I say sexually explicit, you're going to think, oh, it can't be that bad. No. I'm a police officer, and I'm trained to I'm not currently. I was a police officer who was trained to profile sex offenders, and I was learning things in those cards that I had never even heard of. That's how awful and horrific it was. And it talked about urinating on each other, defecating on each other, encouraging watching porn as well to grade 9 class.
Matter of fact, Nadine, and that's part of it. And my apologies for not referencing, and that's what was so intriguing to me, because my background working with sex offenders for 15 years now, And so you have given your background, at least in your video you do, that you were part of law enforcement, trained to interview. You've interviewed a lot of sex offenders. You've worked with those. So you understand, as I do, those of us that have interacted with what we call perps, right? Those of us that have interacted with these kind of guys, we understand that you really can profile them. So I want the viewers to understand, again, that aspect of your background. But to think that what does it take then to shock somebody such as yourself? Though, yes, you're a parent, but you have law enforcement background dealing with sexual predators. So what you're saying is the material being shown to these kids, if they were photographs, whoever was disseminating, it would be disseminating pornography, they'd be arrested. But because they're typically in drawing form, cartoon form, they skirt the law, but the impact is still the same on kids.
And there wasn't just the cards, there was the pamphlet as well, which talked about similar things, as well as even said that drug use can increase sexual pleasure. Like, you should never say that to a child. It's almost encouraging drug use. So, and that pamphlet was handed to the children to bring home, and it's from the same company, CATIE, that made it. And it's not supposed to be for children, but it looks geared towards children because it is cartoons. It's like a kid's book cartoons, which I find just awful that they would even have that. And the really horrifying thing that happened as well with that is there was no accountability. In fact, the statement Planned Parenthood did minimize. They almost put the blame on a child from grabbing that. That's what you'll hear in the media, that a child stole it from a bag. That's not in fact what happened. They engaged the children in the classroom, not the entire class, but a smaller group within the classroom, and handed it to them. And one of the kids was even reading it out loud, and then other kids came in. So the minimizing it by Planned Parenthood, and also the media not having the full story, I think really had a negative effect as well with the parents and the children that were involved, because they were re-victimized by the media, almost blaming the children for this, which I find just shocking how it was twisted. But it brought on really good moves by the provincial government. They banned Planned Parenthood from entering the school and from providing resources, as well as other third-party organizations. And it's also what led to the province doing the same changes permanently with also SOGI and any third-party organization, which I was really happy to see. And this occurred a week following the video that I did exposing these third-party organizations. When I say exposing, when you start looking into like even just what they have on their website, I was shocked to see the things that I saw. Pedophile logos right on their website, and then finding out what they were attempting to do in our school, completely revamp sexual education into one that they wanted to push, which was pleasure-based sexual education versus what they consider the current one, shame-based sexual education. And
Nadine, let me mention, to really help engage the viewer, especially the parent that is just hearing some of this for the first time. First of all, this is going on in all the schools. So under the guise of what's called SOGI Sex Ed, sexual orientation and gender identity, what really has happened is it is the ultimate Trojan horse. And those that are very interested in pushing ultimately a pedophile agenda are having a heyday with this. So it's the perfect Trojan horse to get into the most vulnerable of populations and access to schools, material that's going to ultimately make it easier for grooming. And if you're okay right now, let's play a portion of the video. People can go onto your Twitter page. I'm going to bring that up here. You're paving in this in the video that we're going to see on your page. You're setting the stage for why you were concerned, and you're starting to connect the dots. This is just a minute and a half into this video, It's an 18-minute plus video, so I recommend people go on to your Twitter page and access it. We'll have a link to that. But you're doing a magnificent job in this video as you're going to introduce one of the main forces that went underground, and now it's finding the perfect means of accessing kids.
One of the organizations we learned about the most was the North American Man-Boy Love Association, also known as NAMBLA. They are the biggest known pedophile activist organization in the world. Due to police infiltration, which led to hundreds of arrests, the group doesn't actually meet anymore. However, this doesn't mean that they aren't still active. NAMBLA itself has an interesting history. Its founder was a known gay activist and socialist, and from its early conception, the organization was a part of what is now known as the LGBTQ community. They even took part in early days of pride parades. Their involvement into the International Lesbian and Gay Association led to them being kicked out of the UN. Shortly after, NAMBLA was kicked out and removed from the greater LGBTQ community. However, many within the community still believe they belong. An example of this would be Gail Rubin, who wrote the founding document of what is now known as queer theory. This is the exact document that's behind the gender ideology that's coming into our schools. This founding document is littered with pro-pedophilia language. In fact, this right here is Gail's exact words. It is harder for most people to sympathize with actual boy lovers. Like communists and homosexuals in the 1950s, boy lovers are so stigmatized that it is difficult to find defenders for their civil liberties, let alone for their erotic orientation. I'll be speaking more about this subject, queer theory, as well as SOGI in a future episode. So all this to say, pedophiles have a history of infiltrating the LGBTQ movement, or what is now known as the 2SL LGBTQIA+ movement. In fact, this is listed as one of NAMBLA's main goals, to infiltrate the LGBTQ movement in hopes to one day normalize pedophilia into society. In this release FBI declassified document, it says the following about the NAMBLA organization and its goals and mission. Here's 8 that's listed in that document. End the oppression of pedophiles from having what they consider consensual relationship. Build support networks for pedophiles.
And that's why, Nadine, we're having you on. You've put that together. Again, people need to access that, because that is what's going on with SOGI Sex Ed. It is a backdoor into lowering inhibitions, to introducing sexually deviant material, everything that a sexual predator needs. And look at Planned Parenthood, right? Planned Parenthood is more than happy to have kids become hypersexualized for all sorts of reasons. And they're now a dispenser of the wrong sex hormones, cross-sex hormones, puberty blockers and whatnot. So not only do they have a financial interest in this, but philosophically, they promote all the most deviant of lifestyles. And so it is a huge concern, because it is allowing pedophiles to groom kids under the parents' nose.
I think what's so important about that video is recognizing what it was that NAMBLA fought for. And that's why I listed it, because they haven't gone away. And pedophilia and child sexual abuse is actually way more prevalent today than it was back then. And it's only getting worse. It's a fight that needs to be tackled and needs to be tackled now, because because the more we let this go on, the more damaged society becomes. And you see it a lot more in the LGBTQ movement, because that's the movement that fights for sexual liberties, all kinds. So it's also in their goals to infiltrate it and to use that movement and that community to push their agenda. And unfortunately, there are many people within that community that wants to normalize all sexual deviancy. So there's not many other groups in society that do that. So that's why they're the biggest target to do that. And I think we need to recognize that doesn't mean that everyone in that community is a pedophile. I don't know why these flies keep coming, but
okay, because we're talking about a subject that is rather distasteful, and so flies arrive.
Yeah, exactly. So it's very important to say not everyone in that community is pro pedophilia, and not everyone in that community is a pedophile. They are just the easiest target for these activist organizations to be able to move forward with their agenda. And unfortunately, because the LGBTQ community is one of the what we would consider a minority group, a vulnerable minority group, when they do come in, they often get to do what they want and not have much pushback until just recently, because anytime anyone pushes back, you're being called a homophobe, a bigot, and we're going to see that very much and you're seeing that even with the Million Person March, right? Someone had issues with the sexualization of children. That's why we're marching, but yet they're just saying it's an attack on the entire community. So I think it's very important to state that not everyone within the community is pedophile activists. However, there are a lot of red flags that we find in some of these organizations, and you can't have queer theory with what it's based on without normalizing sexualization of children. The entire document is normalization of any sexual deviancy, all of them. And it even compares pedophilia to having a specific taste in something like spicy food. Like it's unreal. And I think the reason it's been allowed to go this far or been this accepted by society is people don't really know what's behind it. So the mindset, and this is the biggest mindset that I want your viewers to understand, is they believe that a child being sexualized or sexually abused is only traumatic because society has made it not okay.
And that's exactly what sex offenders say.
And exactly. And it's the mindset that sex offenders have in justifying their abuse. And like I said, when I was a former police officer, I think it's very important that I specify what I was trained at. I was trained not just in interviewing, but in profiling sex offenders. So we learned about every single kind of sex offenders, some of the worst. We watched interviews for hours of interviews, and we learned to profile them so we could anticipate what they would do, what the risks were. And one of the biggest, not all, but one of the sectors of pedophiles are the ones who manipulate their victims into believing that they want this. And I'm also a survivor of child sexual abuse. I speak about it in the video. And my abuser was one of those where he used the body's response. I hope it's okay that I go into these kinds of details because parents need to understand.
And they need to understand why this is in the curriculum.
Yeah.
Again, they can try to reframe it however they want, but if you have curriculum that is the ideal for a perp, then the question is, what's up with your curriculum?
I'll go into that just to link the two in a sec. So they really play on the body's response to being aroused. So, and a lot of pedophiles do that to make the child think that they wanted this, right? If your body reacts in arousal, or sometimes it doesn't, and the offender will say, well, you must be gay. If offender's a female on a male, you see that as well. So they really play on that whole arousal and pleasure, like physical pleasure. Now, the entire revamping or attempt at revamping the sexual education program is, they call it a pleasure-based sexual education program. So if it physically feels good, it is good. And as a survivor of sexual abuse, I can tell you even if the body responds in arousal, doesn't mean it feels good. I knew, even at 8 years old, to my core, that what was happening was wrong. And it wasn't because someone told me. I knew it in my spirit. I knew it in my gut. And I think that kind of teaching is extremely dangerous. And I think it's opening the door for children who are victims or who may become victims to not speaking up against it, because they'll think, oh, my body's reacting in arousal, therefore it's not wrong.
Yeah, that's such a key point, Nadine, that you just made, meaning what you just indicated is that it'll inhibit disclosure on the part of young survivors, because it's reframing abuse. So a kid in their heart of hearts, just as you said when you were in grade 3, that you knew it was wrong, but if you then have a class that says, no, this is right, or this isn't abuse, then it's rare that a child discloses. Children have a very hard time disclosing. That's in and of itself. But now if you add additional material in class that normalizes this, then it's much less likely that a child is ever going to disclose. That's also why Planned Parenthood likes this, because Planned Parenthood has a policy, it's an unwritten practice of don't ask, don't tell. So Planned Parenthood is a predator's best friend, because if I'm a perp, I get a kid pregnant, I can take the kid to Planned Parenthood. They'll never ask about me, even though I drove the kid there. So a child can be in Planned Parenthood without the parent knowing.
Is Planned Parenthood an NGO?
Sorry?
Is Planned Parenthood in Saskatchewan an NGO, a non-governmental organization?
I'm not sure. They do get a lot of their funding from provincial and federal government.
So we like to say, always follow the money, Nadine, always follow the money. Where's the money coming from? Who is directing? And
yeah, they're a nonprofit, but they get huge boatloads of money. And so they can also then influence via campaign contributions.
Yeah. I also want to add, like, if it's okay, I'm just going to go a little bit back to why I also think this sexualization of children in classroom is very dangerous as well. A lot of sexual abuse happens with older children onto younger children. So whether it be siblings, neighbors, and stuff like that. When you introduce early sexual education to children who don't necessarily understand the consequences of their action, and we know that happens a lot in youth. That's why when you turn 18, your criminal record gets erased. I have issues with children being sexualized or learned about certain behavior, certain things before they're of the age of recognizing the consequences. And unfortunately, I believe it's leading to an increase in sexual behavior between older children and younger children. So I think there needs to be a reevaluation to see what is age appropriate, and is it beneficial for children, or is it increasing the risk of even abuse between children as well, especially when they don't understand the consequences of their actions.
And thinking about the mind of a perp and the methods, and you've studied them. You worked in law enforcement, Nadine. I do 4 groups per week of sex offenders, and then worked with them in the prison system. People need to understand that if a child is sexualized, now they're going to act out on another child. It's not uncommon also to still have a perp that's perping on a younger child, and now that child's going to perp on another child, but you have still an adult perp in that child's life. And before you know it, we find out there's filming taking place, because kids don't know that they are being manipulated into, oftentimes, child pornography is being filmed. There's a lot of things that can go on, that these perpetrators are amazingly, diabolically creative.
And you have to understand too, one of the biggest signs that a child is being abused by another adult, or is the early sexualization, right? It's one of the biggest signs that they're a victim of sexual abuse, when they know things at an age that they shouldn't. Now, if you start sexualizing every child, you're not going to be able to see those differences and you might be less likely to find a child that has been sexually abused and be able to help them. But yeah, that's the thing. There's often an adult behind that. And I'm not saying that every teacher who teaches sex ed is that, but we got to understand pedophiles, how they work. They groom themselves into position where they have easy access to children and unsupervised access to children. And because of that, there's certain sectors of society that are at greater risk. School is one of those biggest sectors of society. There is quite a lot of pedophiles who will actually become teachers so that they have access. You have it as well in churches because there's easy access to children unsupervised. And in sports team, I know you're a coach there, Brad, but I'm not saying that every coach or every teacher or every youth pastor is a pedophile, but we have to understand they will groom themselves into positions where they will have access to children, and the key there is unsupervised. And I think we need to understand too, within these the LGBTQ or the trans movement, they often will have peer groups where an adult who's a trans, they'll team them up with youths so that they can feel supported. And again, it's opening up that environment where you have someone who's even more vulnerable. It's not a secret that the LGBTQ kids are more vulnerable for sexual abuse. That's actually a fact. It's been stated. And now you're going to team them up with an adult that has special relationships, unsupervised, often communication. And you find out a lot with these support groups as well that these kids get, like whether it's chat groups, they will often have adults who are
You're talking
predators.
about the handler now, the handler who's almost in the same position as a pimp. Am I right, John?
Absolutely. And Nadine has no doubt seen it in law enforcement, right? I work with the guys on the back end and I see the police reports, but on the front end, Nadine is talking not just theoretically, but she has worked with these guys and profiled them. Absolutely.
And like I'm stating some cases, again, I'm not saying everyone is like that, but because it's a high risk environment, I think schools need to do a lot more to protect. And right now the policies they're putting through in schools is actually doing the opposite. It's creating secrecy. It's creating an environment where these pedophiles, and I say these, I might use the term males. We have to remember as well, there's a lot of female offenders out there. You might not deal with them because a lot of the time they don't get charged because we minimize female to male child abuse. But when I was trained to profile, 1 in 4 sex offenders were females. So, and that number might be, some people might not believe that, but as a police officer, that's what I was trained so that we didn't put pedophiles in a box. But keeping that in mind, classrooms and schools should be doing everything they can to minimize the risk. And unfortunately, I'm really against some of these policies happening in the school because you're basically creating a situation where children will become more at risk.
It's setting it up. Nadine, let's have you hold that thought. We're going to come back for part 2, picking up where we're stopping right now, so it's a cliffhanger, but that's a huge concern that under the guise of inclusivity, under the guise of no judgment, under the guise of this supposed trans, which again, there are no trans kids, there's no trans people, there are kids that are gender confused. They've been confused. They're just kids. But this sets up the perfect opportunity for grooming. So even if somebody wants to say, no, there are trans communities, they're setting these kids up to be easy targets. So stay right there. We will continue in part 2. Nadine, thank you so much for bringing your knowledge, your fund of knowledge, both as a former police officer, now as someone who is really trying to awaken parents to what's going on in schools. And Brad, I know as a dad, myself as a dad, and you, we need to be concerned.
Absolutely. I think that, we keep talking about, the organizations that are responsible around this, and we worry about the adults a lot, and what we're seeing now because of this movement within our schools, I'm more worried now, not about the teacher, not about the government. I'm worried about the kids in that school who are being empowered to act that way, to participate in it, and to pull that kind of sexual deviance off against other classmates and other students. This is Unmasking the Trans Movement. I'm Brad Wilder on behalf of John Euler and Nadine Ness. Thank you very much to everybody for being here. Remember, part 2 is on the way. We'll see you soon. Remember, it's not our kids' fight, it's our fight.